This is a lecture that I custom wrote for this seminar, so I hope it makes sense. I haven't given it before in this form. And last time I was here, I gave 2 lectures, and the first one was on monetary theory. And in the discussion during the entire week, I felt that we didn't really have a framework for talking about what the proper role of government is. So people would make assertions, I think government should do X. And then what is your argument for that? Well, I feel that way. Or it's part of my idea of what a nice society would be like. So I thought it would be helpful to at least see how economic theorists have tried to frame the issue of what roles are appropriately assigned to government in a market economy. So the slide is not just designed to echo the logo of the Jerusalem Institute, but this is the citadel. This is the emblem of government. So I'm asking you to put yourself in the position of a judge when somebody says, we should have the government do this, and somebody else says, no, we should let the market do this. So you're a judge in kind of like a singing contest. And if you don't remember anything else from this lecture, remember this. The mistake that some judges in the past have made has been they hear the first contestant and they say, oh, that's terrible. He missed some notes. Let's give the prize to the second contestant. And now, wait a minute. You haven't heard the second contestant yet. So I'm going to talk about theories of where and under what conditions markets fail in the sense of failing to reach an ideal outcome, failing to reach optimality, or you might even say fail to reach perfection. But that's not sufficient grounds for saying, well, then government should intervene. There is a big jump there. You have to examine how governments operate, whether governments are subject to the same kind of failures. And there's some very famous economists, Joseph Stiglitz is the one I have in mind, who like to make this leap. Here's my model. In my model, the market fails. He's not even looking out the window. He's looking at the blackboard. In my model, the market fails. Therefore, there's a case for government intervention. Well, but he's comparing an imagined market, which is imperfect, to an imagined government which is perfect. Right? That's not a fair comparison. We need to compare either theoretically market failures to government failures, or in actual fact, which better promotes the ends we care about. So the end we care about, at least as economists frame the question, so I'm not proposing this as the last word in political philosophy about other tasks or other visions people might have of government. But if you think of the task of government as to improve economic welfare, that is, to improve people's lives as they themselves see it, the standard notion of the best we can do is called Pareto efficiency. So Pareto was an Italian economist who came up with this idea. And the idea is pretty simple. We want all the potential gains from trade to be captured. That is, if I own a resource and I value it at $100 and somebody else values it at $200, then that's an imperfection. It would be better. I'd be better off to take $150 for it. I don't value it that highly. The other person would be better off. They value it at $200. They can get it for $150 from me. We're both better off. Nobody else is worse off. That's a Pareto improvement. Right? It's a mutually beneficial gain from trade without making any third party worse off. So a Pareto efficient economy is one that captures all the potential gains from trade. And if you're in a Pareto optimum, then you can't make anybody in the economy better off without making somebody worse off. You can't reallocate ownership of resources in a way that makes both parties better off, because by assumption, all those mutually beneficial trades have already been made. But starting from where we are, the question is not how do we get to an optimum, but when a proposal is made for a program, is it an improvement? And a Pareto improvement is one that has at least one gainer and no losers. And that's in the eyes of the people themselves. Would they agree to it? So that's the test. So it's a consent-based standard. It passes a unanimity test, you might say. There's nobody who has any reason to vote against it. Now that's a pretty exacting standard when you talk about any major public policy change. There are always going to be people who object. So there's a kind of weaker standard that in a sense more practical to implement called Calder-Hicks efficiency. And Calder-Hicks efficiency says, well, we don't have to get complete unanimity if we know that the gains to the gainers exceed the losses to the losers, so that in principle, we could take some of the gains and use them to compensate the losers from the change, to bring them up at least to where they were before. And if we did that, then everybody would agree to it. But if the compensation side payments are hard to arrange, that shouldn't stop us from going ahead with the policy improvement. So if you think of it that way, the question about the role of government is, starting from where we are, what roles for government are Pareto improvements or Calder-Hicks improvements over the starting point we find ourselves in, right? How many of you have seen The Seven Samurai? Greatest movie of all time? Oh, I'm disappointed. Anyway, the plot of the story is that there's a small village of farmers, and they grow grain and they store grain for the winter. And there's a group of roving bandits. This was remade by Hollywood as The Magnificent Seven. Maybe some of you have seen that. Magnificent Seven's been remade many times. Anyway, the bandits come and take their grain. So the villagers get together and say, what can we do to stop this? Let's hire somebody to defend our village. And they go and hire the Seven Samurai. Now, is that an example of government in action? Well, all the villagers agreed to it. So you could just as easily say, this is a voluntary effort. It isn't really a government, it's just an ad hoc agreement. You can think of it as a contractual agreement among all the villagers. They share the cost of hiring the samurai to defend them. So if you think of government as something that brings about Pareto improvements, it's almost, well, it's kind of denaturing it. It's no longer coercive. It's no longer compulsory. It's in principle something to which we all would have agreed. Now, of course, we didn't. We were born into a society with a government, and we were not asked, do you agree? Will you sign on this line to the following set of roles for the government, this set of government programs? Oh, and if you won't sign, you don't have to pay? No, we don't get that choice. So that's why I say it's a conceptual test. Would we agree? So this is a kind of parable about a collective action problem, right? So both markets, so you can think of societies facing problems like keeping out the roving bandits that cannot be done by any one individual in the village. There's nobody in this farming village rich enough to hire defense for the entire village. Right? So they pool their resources. It's a collective action problem. But it can be done voluntarily, right? If it is something, if you have a small enough number of people, and it's in their interest enough to pay for it. Here's what Adam Smith had to say, going back to the founder of economics, about the roles of government. And he said, well, we all agree government should provide external defense against enemies and keep law and order, policing and criminal justice, the court system. And I'm not going to talk about those because we're not really on that margin. There are sort of political philosophers who question whether these could be privatized, but I'm not going to go there. But I want to talk about the other things Smith saw as roles for government. I guess I better read it because I'm not sure how well you can read it. He talked about undertakings, quote, which, though they may be in the highest degree advantageous to a great society, are, however, of such a nature that the profit, because it's providing benefits to the society, that's what he means by the profit, could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individuals, and which it therefore cannot be expected that any individual or small number of individuals should erect or maintain. Right? So he's pointing to collective action problems. Unfortunately, all his examples are bad examples. His examples of things that government needs to do under this category are highways, canals, bridges, harbors, and post offices. And I say they're all bad examples because these are all things that can and have been, and in Smith's time even were, provided by private enterprise. Right? Toll roads, canals built by private enterprise and financed by charging tolls to the boats, bridges financed by tolls, harbors financed by tolls for docking your boat, post offices, charges for delivering letters. So these are not good examples of enterprises which can't be done by people who recoup the expenses by charging the beneficiaries. We're going to have to find some better examples. But this is the Pareto standard. It's the idea that there's, at least in principle or conceptually, we could all agree to what you might call a social contract to calibrate taxes in such a way to finance what we regard as public goods. Right? So in the case of the villagers who hired the 7 samurai, and I don't want to spoil the ending of the movie, but the villagers are lucky that the 7 samurai, after they drive off the roving bandits, don't decide to settle down and become stationary bandits, living at the expense of the villagers. They hired good people, lucky for them. But suppose there's something like defending the village that can't be done by private enterprise on a user pays basis, but if we abstract from all the organizational and transactional problems of arranging this, people would be willing to pay enough in total to cover the cost of production for this collectively enjoyed good. So if a public enterprise can provide this good by taxing people, but not by taxing anyone more than that individual is willing to pay, right? So this is the test for unanimity. Nobody has to pay more than they would be willing to pay. Then we would all agree to such an arrangement ex ante, because it's, by assumption, it's providing a benefit to each of us greater than we're being asked to pay. So gains from trade for everybody. That enterprise is capturing gains from trade. It's a Pareto improvement. Now, there is a kind of conceptual question here, which is if it's possible to make this kind of arrangement and be assured that nobody's paying more than they're willing to pay, why couldn't a private entrepreneur go around and sign everybody up before actually incurring the cost of providing the good? And there are some goods that are provided that way. But again, as I said, if you really hold government to a strict, in principle, unanimity standard, then it's hard to see why it couldn't be provided privately. We've kind of reduced government to a contractual arrangement. So these kind of goods are called public goods, goods that can only be provided collectively and not on a user pays basis. And so the question that raises is, what goods does this include? What kind of goods, what characteristics of goods make it hard or, in the limit, impossible to provide them entrepreneurially through a user pays arrangement, the way we count upon to provide most goods? So, typical private good, chocolate donut. I haven't seen any at the buffet here, but there have been pretty good substitutes. The first characteristic that creates a public good, and so in the economic lexicon, public good doesn't mean a good provided by government. It means a good with these characteristics such that it's difficult to provide it any other way. But the government can provide private goods, and the private sector can provide public goods. Right? It's a characteristic of the good, not of the mechanism that's actually used to provide it. So, chocolate donut, private good, exhibits what's called non-rivalry in consumption. No, it exhibits rivalry in consumption. Right? If I eat the donut, you can't eat it too. We don't share in the consumption of the donut. The benefits of eating the donut don't just shower down on everybody. One person eats it, nobody else eats it. That's rivalry. By contrast, this is a broadcast tower for radio or television. Broadcast signals shower down on everyone equally. And if I tune in a radio station, it doesn't reduce the amount of radio station that you can tune in. So our consumption is non-rival. Right? So that's non-rivalry in consumption. And it's typically harder to charge people for goods like that because you can't even tell when they're consuming and when they're not consuming. Who even knows if you've got your radio turned on and tuned to a certain station? You're not doing anything detectable to diminish the amount of signal available to other people. The real crucial characteristic, though, is non-excludability. It's hard to charge people. One reason might be that you can't even tell who's consuming and who isn't, but if it's the nature of the good that you can't exclude people once you provide it to anyone, you provide it to everyone, then it's hard to charge people. So on the left, I have a picture of an old-fashioned bus toll collector, money box. That's where you put your money in to ride the bus. Buses are provided by governments in lots of places, but that doesn't make them public goods. It's very easy to exclude people from the bus. Don't pay the fare, can't get on the bus. Right? And private enterprises have provided buses in lots of places. So if governments are providing bus service, it's not because it's a public good, it's for some other reason. But here's my example of a public good, fixing the hole in the ozone layer. Right? So radiation comes through these holes in the ozone layer and gives people sunburns. That's bad. If there's some policy for repairing the hole in the ozone layer, you can't really go around and say, okay, Mr. Smith, did you pay your ozone tax? No? Well, then we're going to leave the hole over your backyard. You're going to get a sunburn if you don't pay. No, there's no exclusion device like that. Right? So it's infeasible to provide it for just the people who pay. Can you think of other examples of that sort of good? If you provide it to anybody, you provide it to everybody? Yeah?
Security.
Sorry?
Security. An army, for example.
So if you think of defending the nation as a whole, then you've kind of defined it as a collectivity that's being defended, then yes, you can't, two people are neighbors, you can't defend one's nation without defending the other's nation. There's another hand.
Public park.
Well, lots of public, well, if you define it as a park without any gates, then yes. But yeah, there are parks that are gated, and only if you pay can you get into the park. There's a famous one in Florida called Disney World.
I'm talking about just like a small one inside the city, like a garden.
Well, there are small city parks that are, in New York City, for example, there's a park called Gramercy Park, which is owned by the owners of the houses that face it, and it's got a gate. But if you want an open access park, then almost by definition, you're not going to be able to exclude people. In some places, in order to pay for the lifeguards on the public beach, they exclude people who don't pay for access to the beach. And it's usually not a gate. It's usually you have to buy a tag and display it on your swimsuit. And somebody comes along and checks. And if you don't have the tag, you pay a fine. So in many cases, it's a question of thinking about possible exclusion devices. So you don't want to jump to the conclusion that it's not excludable just because in some cases it's provided without exclusion. Is there another? Yeah. Yeah, streetlights are an interesting case. So streetlights do provide light for more than one house. And anybody passing by sort of benefits from the streetlight. There are streetlights, well, there are private streets in some places, and there the street light is paid for by the contributions of the owners of the street, who are the owners of the houses facing the street.
And yet, if somebody in that block doesn't pay, he still gets the electricity.
Well, when you buy a house in a neighborhood like that, there's a clause in the deed which says you are obligated to pay for the street lights. And so if you don't pay for the streetlights, then the tax authorities come and, I don't know, tap into your bank account somehow. So there are, in some cases, there are contractual ways of providing streetlights. Right? Streetlight doesn't help an infinite number of people. It actually helps a very small number of people, and so it's not that hard to round up those people and arrange a mechanism for them to pay. I live in a neighborhood where the people on my block chose not to pay for streetlights, so it's dark. The next block over, they have streetlights. Now, they don't charge me for walking down their block, so I don't have to pay for the streetlight, which is great for me. But I'll come back to the problem of free riding in a second. Yeah.
But like, as you said, traffic lights.
So traffic lights are for the control of traffic on public roads. If you had privately owned roads, you would presumably have privately owned traffic lights. But how to exclude people from roads is a problem that used to be, well, we just don't think it's worthwhile in most cities. Singapore, though, has this system. It's like an electronic toll collection system, but it monitors what streets you drive on and it sends you a bill, right? So it is possible to monitor use and charge accordingly. Now, it raises all kinds of privacy concerns, but I guess privacy in Singapore is not that valued. Yeah.
What about like air filtration systems? So everyone's breathing in the clean oxygen. But
Well, when you say filtration system, that sounds like inside a building. And most air filtration systems are privately provided. They're provided by the owner of the building. But if you mean air pollution generally, outdoors, yeah, then I'm with you. Then it's a lot like the ozone example.
Yeah, I thought about maybe culture events that you can't really count who's coming in, who's not, and you want to create some kind of vibe in your city, and you have to charge the people in your city about for that.
Yeah, so that's an interesting example because a lot of cultural events are, of course, provided indoors and you have to buy a ticket to get in. And a lot are provided outdoors with a fence around the event and you have to pay to get in.
Not in Israel, there is many examples like
Yeah,
that.
that's why.
Elsewhere in the world, maybe you heard of Woodstock, where they had a hard time actually collecting the money.
In Independence Day in Israel, there is a lot of free shows.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so you certainly can mount an event that way and decide it's not worth it to charge people because it's easy just to add it to the tax bill. And then as a taxpayer, your question is, do I want this? Is this something that benefits me as somebody who's not interested in that kind of music or that particular event? And you might feel, well, some events I don't care about, but the overall scheme of things, I think it's worth it. And then you may be somebody who thinks, no, the whole thing is not worth it. I'm being taxed for something I don't derive any enjoyment from.
But if you have like a variety through the year, a variety of events, and you choose like out of 10, you choose to come to 4 of them, you're still part of it. Like,
is there any mechanism for eliciting from people what kind of events they want and what they're willing to pay for them?
Experience.
Well, you see how many people show up. I guess that's right.
Yeah. It's most of the cases in Israel. It's not managed by the government, but in the cities, the city hall is the one who do it, and he knows what his citizens want. No, by experience.
Okay. Well, let me move on. We'll come back to these issues. So the market is said to fail when, because you can't exclude people, you have to provide it to everybody. When you go around and ask people, please pay your share, they say, well, why should I? I'm going to enjoy it anyway. Right? I'm going to enjoy the effort to repair the ozone layer. I'm going to enjoy watching the NASA space mission on TV, whether I pay for it or not. my contribution isn't going to decide whether the project goes forward or not. So when you don't exclude people, then free riding, not volunteering to pay, becomes a dominant strategy. You're going to enjoy it anyway, whether you pay or not, so why pay? So when that prevents the good from being provided in the first place, right? Nobody's paying, so there isn't the wherewithal to do the project, then you're not capturing all the potential gains from trade, right? By assumption, we have a case where if you could get everybody to pay, what they would be willing to pay exceeds what it costs to do the project. One thing to consider, though, is that if you're not capturing potential gains from trade, you're actually providing an opportunity for entrepreneurs who can figure out how to charge people. So in introducing new exclusion devices can turn a public good into a private good. So broadcast television I used as an example of a public good, but satellite television, right, where you charge people to be hooked up to receive the code in order to descramble the broadcast, that people can get charged for. And the people who came up with this exclusion device have made a business out of it. New ways of tolling on highways have made it possible to privately build highways and capture some more gains from trade. Charging for parking makes it possible to provide more parking and capture gains from trade that you don't get if, say, you're not allowed to charge for parking, or you don't have a technology for charging for parking. But of course we have parking meters, and now we have more convenient electronic ways of charging for parking. So some things that used to be difficult to charge for are now easier to charge for. And if the reason to have those things in the public sector was there's no easy way to charge for them, now they should be moved to the private sector. So we've got two characteristics, and that gives us a 2x2 matrix in which we can categorize different kinds of goods. So if it's rival and excludable, that's the chocolate donut or a fish dinner. That's a private good. There's no problem of market failure there. Markets will provide as many fish dinners as people are willing to pay cost-covering prices for. If you have a rival good, but you have trouble excluding people from taking it or benefiting from it. So if it's a rival good, that means capturing it and excluding other people then from enjoying it. So think about fish in the ocean. If there's no way of stopping fishing boats, then whoever captures it gets it and excludes other people from enjoying it. And that can lead to a problem, the tragedy of the commons, it's called, where the resource is overexploited. And I'll talk about ways to deal with that in a second. If you have a good that's excludable, but it's non-rival in consumption, so satellite TV is like that. If I tune in a satellite TV program, I'm not reducing the amount of the signal that other people can tune in and enjoy. We can call that a club good. So club good in the sense that the provider of satellite TV can't just go sell it to people on an a la carte, pay-as-you-go basis. They need to line up enough people who are willing to pay for it to pay for the satellite, right? Which is providing this good to lots of people collectively. But there are profits to be made, so shouldn't expect markets to fail to provide goods in this case where the total willingness to pay exceeds the cost of providing it. But in the public goods sector, and I like broadcast TV as an example to make the point that it can be provided privately sometimes. In the case of broadcast TV, how is it financed when it's provided privately? You do have private TV stations? Yeah, okay. How is it financed? Advertising, right? So you can't watch the show without watching the advertising that interrupts it, unless you have a digital video recorder that skips past the commercials, and that's created a problem for traditional broadcast television. They're having trouble lining up advertisers because the advertisers know people are going to record the program and then skip the ads. So what am I paying for ad time for? I mentioned the problem of the common pool. In Iceland, they came up with a brilliant solution to this. Right? So Iceland, this is a cod. Iceland has the biggest cod fisheries in the world. But they were having a problem of depletion of the fish because under the capture rule, if you have a fishing boat, you think, well, if I don't take the fish, it's not going to be there for me to catch next year. Somebody else is going to catch it. So I might as well grab it, even the small fish. And then you get the tragedy of overfishing. And this map of Iceland, the red clusters show the population density of fish in the surrounding waters, and it was going down, right? There was overfishing of the cod stock. They instituted something called individual tradable quotas. So they said there are too many fish being taken out. First, we exclude the Japanese fishing boats. Right? And it's not that they have a big navy, but they have, satellite monitors, and they have shame. But then how do we keep Icelandic fishing boats from overfishing? We give each boat a quota, such that the total number of quotas equals the sustainable catch. And they're tradable so that if you're retiring from the fishing industry, you can sell your quota to somebody else. And if you have an old leaky boat and it costs you a lot to operate, somebody with a more efficient boat who can catch the fish at a lower cost will be willing to pay you for the quota because they can use it more efficiently than you can. They'll pay more for it than it's worth to you given your costs of operating your boat. So the quotas have been traded, and now they were initially assigned to the boats that were already in operation. They've been traded, and so now only the most efficient boats are catching fish, but the depletion of the fishing stock has ended. And in the latest 2015 map, that's 16 actually, you can see the fishing stocks have come back. So it's a big success story for instituting, well, what you can call private property rights in a common pool resource. All right, so it's not that each fish has a tag on it saying, I belong to Olaf Olafsson, but the number of fish a boat is allowed to take is limited by its quota, and they're monitored for not exceeding the quota. Now, here's the big problem with public goods theory. It's inherently non-falsifiable, the claim that something is a public good. And this gets back to the question of whether it's a scientific theory that was raised yesterday. If we don't charge people, maybe because we can't, because there's no effective exclusion device, we don't know what people are willing to pay. Right? We only know what people are willing to pay for a loaf of bread by observing what they do in the supermarket, how much they actually are willing to pay for how many loaves of bread. Absent that sort of test of willingness to pay, we're at sea without a compass. We don't know what the value people assign to these goods are. You can't just ask them, how valuable is a concert by this artist in your city with a zero price ticket? Oh, it would be worth a great deal to me. Well, the fans are going to exaggerate what they're willing to pay, and people who are not fans might exaggerate in the other direction. There's no sort of test of truth-telling. There's no demand revelation mechanism is the technical term for that problem. So putting taxes on people doesn't reveal what they're willing to pay, because you pay the tax whether you care about the good or not. So I said, in theory, if we could calibrate the taxes such that nobody pays more than they're willing to pay, then we get unanimous agreement. But there's no way to do that. There's no way to calibrate taxes to what people are genuinely willing to pay in the absence of actually charging them and seeing what they're willing to pay. So that's a problem. The fact that the market fails to solve this problem doesn't mean that anybody else can solve it. An economist named Harold Demsetz called the nirvana fallacy, to think that, well, if the market can't generate this information, then government can, as though government had some magic wand for eliciting truth-telling from people. Right? But we don't live in that world. Is a sports stadium a public good? Pretty easy to exclude people, find out what they're willing to pay. Now, people who support the public subsidies for sports stadiums will, of course, come up with public goods arguments. They'll say, look, it's not just the people who attend the match who are benefiting. It's everybody in the city, knowing that there's this team representing their city and giving them pride in the city. Okay, what's that really worth to people? We don't really have any test. It's just cheap talk to say it's worth a lot to people. The argument has been made by an economist, formerly famous economist named Lester Thurow at MIT, whose nickname is Less Thorough, that redistributing wealth to alleviate poverty is a public good. What makes it public? Well, because we all enjoy seeing the poor lifted up by our joint efforts. Well, if you care about that, why don't you just give money yourself? No, that's not the good. The good is seeing lots of people helped, which takes everybody's participation. Well, how do we know what people are really willing to pay to see that? Right? A famous example in the economics literature is the lighthouse. So, I think this is the lighthouse in Jaffa. Anyway, some what you might call armchair economists, A.C. Pagoo, Paul Samuelson in his textbook, when they go to explain the theory of public goods, say, well, consider a lighthouse. It's kind of like a big example of a street light. Lighthouses benefit all the ships that pass by, and of course there's no way to charge them, therefore it's going to be underprovided, market failure, therefore government has to provide lighthouses. Ronald Coase, who's more famous for other things that I'll discuss in a minute, actually went and looked into the archives, got out of his armchair and went to the archives, and discovered that most of the lighthouses in Great Britain were in fact privately provided. How do they charge for it? Most lighthouses are outside harbors. They charge when you dock your boat at the harbor. You get charged a fee which goes to cover the cost of the lighthouse.
And was it owned by the port itself?
The customs officials, while they were collecting the customs, would collect the lighthouse fee. So my caution is be careful about coming up with examples of public goods from your armchair. There may be exclusion devices and ways of charging for it that you haven't thought of. Now, externalities are the name we give to goods that are kind of partially public goods. That is, it's not that they're equally consumed by everybody, but they have big spillover effects to people outside the primary consumer, you might say. So this is a car I used to own, the 1963 Ford Falcon Futura, Emerald red with the black convertible top. It's a beautiful car, I think you'll agree. When I would drive it down the street with the top open, I get lots of people giving me the thumbs up symbol, but nobody tossed money into the back seat to help me keep the car running. So I was privately bearing the cost that had lots of spillover benefits. Now, of course, I didn't want people to toss coins, only paper money. Well, they didn't, so I decided to sell the car. It wasn't worth it, providing this benefit to everybody else. So it's a frivolous example, but if there are positive spillover effects that the provider is not compensated for, then as measured by imagined willingness to pay, it's underprovided. Of course, we're more famous with negative externalities like pollution, right? And clearly a serious problem. People really are willing to pay for pollution abatement. We're not sure exactly how much, but we know they're willing to pay something because people buy medicines to alleviate the symptoms of bad air on their respiratory tract. So what people victimized by pollution might be willing to pay to cut back on the volume of pollution might be enough to cover the cost of a pollution abatement device for the factory, or it might be worth more than the entire factory. It might be the optimal thing is to shut it down or move it somewhere else where the pollution's not going to affect so many people. That's an example of potential gains from trade not being grasped. So yeah, that's a market failure. It's a market failure because, go back to the fisheries case, it's like a common pool problem, or in this case, a common sink problem. People are using the airshed as a waste sink, despoiling it for other people because nobody owns it, because there aren't any property rights in the airshed where if you dump garbage on your neighbor's backyard, that's not a problem. They go to court and get you to stop. If you dump pollution into a river, many rivers are covered by riparian rights doctrines, at least in common law countries, where the people living along the river can sue the polluter. But nobody owns the airshed, and it's hard to think of ways to assign property rights to the airshed where somebody will have the standing to sue the polluter. Class action suits are a possible kind of judicial approach, but they have their own problems. Yeah.
I just wonder if there's something, what do you think about the government job to educate people for some values? Like,
Let me hold that to the end, okay? So we can get into more specific cases. Let me finish the spiel. But yeah, this is a problem. The problem is knowing how damaging the pollution really is, what people are willing to pay to abate it, and what are the efficient ways of abating it, the efficient extent to which to abate it. But some things that people have imagined were externalities turn out not to be externalities, kind of like the lighthouse. James Mead, another armchair economist, writes a textbook in which he says, well, look, bees provide pollination services to orchards, and yet the bees are free agents. They're not compensated for this. Therefore, there's not enough bee pollination provided. There's an externality here. There's under-provision of pollination services. Yeah, no, go to an actual orchard, an actual commercial orchard, and what you will find is people arriving with flatbed trucks stacked with beehives. And then the beehives are distributed. This one's actually inside a greenhouse, but plants in greenhouses have to be pollinated too. Beekeepers make a business of providing the pollination services to the orchards. And Steve Chung, in his article, The Fable of the Bees, explained this. So what could be externalities if nobody charged for them are internalized through the price mechanism. It's not a market failure case. So this brings us to the famous analysis of externalities by Ronald Coase, Nobel Prize winner for his article entitled The Problem of Social Cost, published in 1960. And Coase's name is attached to something called the Coase theorem, which Coase himself is not too fond of, but it was named by somebody else. Nobody names a theorem after themselves. So Coase's point is that if property rights are well assigned in cases of interactions where people's activities are harmful to each other, so he stressed the sort of the symmetry of the interaction in many cases. In the case of air pollution, we think of one factory victimizing thousands of people. But in other cases, one person's activity interferes with another's, and it's not that one party is more to blame than the other. His original example was he was writing about the broadcast spectrum. And in a 1959 article on the Federal Communications Commission, he said, look, it's crazy to have a system in which the government owns the airwaves and just licenses them to people on a temporary basis. Then the owners of the license don't own the spectrum frequency. They don't invest as much because the license could be taken away from them. And so you don't get radio being efficiently allocated. to the different kinds of formats that people really want, right? The right number of news stations and music stations of various kinds. And kind of just as an aside in this article, Coase says, oh, it doesn't really matter who you assign the licenses to initially. They can be resold until the people who have the most productive use for them, who are willing to pay the most for them, therefore, end up with them. So no matter where you start, you'll end up with an efficient allocation of resources. The initial assignment doesn't really matter. And it doesn't matter to how the resource ends up being used. So the way the resources end up being used is independent of who's initially assigned ownership. And this was regarded as shocking to the members of the Chicago Economics Department. Coase's article was published in the Journal of Law and Economics, which was published at the University of Chicago. So Coase came back to Chicago a year later to give a different paper. And he knew that everybody in the economics department, I mean, Milton Friedman, Al Harburger, John McGee, George Stigler, all the big guns, thought that there was something wrong with his theory. So they arranged a dinner party at the house of Aaron Director, who was the editor of the Journal of Law and Economics. And Stigler writes about this later. He says, so we had a discussion, kind of an unusual dinner party where one person goes to be grilled by 20 top flight economists. Stigler says later, when we started the discussion, it was 20 against the Coase argument to 1 in favor. That was Coase. By the time we finished, like 2 hours later, it was 21 to nothing in favor. I wish I had taped the event. And Coase's own recollection is that it was Milton Friedman who did most of the grilling. And he said, once you get past a half an hour of Milton Friedman grilling you, if you're still standing, then you know you've won. Because if he can't knock you out in half an hour, then your argument has to be pretty solid. So here's the basic proposition. The example I like better, I mean, the famous example of the Coase theorem is a railroad throwing sparks onto a field of crops, causing damage. The example I like better is, and these are drawn from actual legal cases where these things were hashed out. Suppose somebody's operating a noisy candy factory and there's a doctor's office next door. So the doctor can't examine his patients with the candy machines going. There's too much noise and vibration. He says, look, the candy factory owner and the doctor can get together and decide what is it worth to the doctor to shut down the machines for an hour, and which hours of the day are the most valuable to him, right? So the doctor can, if it's the candy owner that has the right to run the machines, the doctor will pay him, if it's worth enough, to shut down the machines during the hours the doctor wants to examine patients. If it's the doctor who owns the right, he can go to court and stop the candy machine from running, then the candy owner will pay the doctor, let me operate these hours of the day, and they can arrive at a price where the doctor's, it's not worth that much to the doctor during the middle of the night, for example. So they can arrive at an efficient allocation of resources. The standard approach to externalities associated with Pagoo was tax the polluter. And Coase makes the point that to tax the polluter the right amount to get to the efficient allocation, you have to know what the efficient allocation is. I mean, you have to know how many hours a day it's worth it to run the candy and which hours of the day it's worth it to run the noisy candy equipment. He says, but no judge knows that. No tax authority knows that. You need to see interactions between people who are affected, bargaining to a solution to actually discover what the highest value of the resource is. So the Pagovian approach to taxing externalities is the wrong approach in any case, in any circumstance where you can let people negotiate to a solution. Now, there are cases where it's not plausible that people can negotiate to a solution. Cases of large numbers, cases like factory pollution affecting thousands of people. Thousands of people are not going to be able to each sign a contract with the factory as to how much pollution is okay. In the case of air pollution caused by cars, you not only have thousands or millions in a big city of people breathing in bad air, but you've got millions of people creating bad air. So in those kind of cases, maybe the best thing you can do is have government handle the problem. It's hard to think of a way to negotiate the outcome in that kind of case. But where you can negotiate, it's a better approach for eliciting the information you need to actually do it efficiently, meaning not provide more or less than people are willing to pay for. So there's an approach to government in general that sort of hooks into this discussion I've been giving of when people want government or will benefit from government handling the problem. And the famous work in this line is The Calculus of Consent by Buchanan and Tullock. Buchanan, another Nobel Prize winner. Tullock was not given the Nobel Prize for, I guess, personality reasons. He went to Sweden and insulted all the Swedish economists because that was his style, but it came back to haunt him. This year's Nobel Prize winner was Richard Thaler, whose most famous book was co-authored by Cass Sunstein. Sunstein did not share the prize, so you could say Sunstein was Tullocked. It's a new verb. But the way they pose the question is, how can we arrange it such that government is beneficial and not a net cost to people, provides benefits in excess of its costs? That's the problem. The way they put this is that the whole game of politics be positive sum. Right? That the interaction between the citizen and the state is a benefit to the citizen and not a net burden. And they examine ways of trying to arrange decision-making within the government. So now we're getting to the problem of government failure. Right? So if the market process can't reach efficiency, what's your alternative? Can you rely on an expert to be disinterested and have the information to solve the problem? That's a kind of nirvana fallacy because, as I said before, there's no way the expert can have the information on what people are willing to pay. And then the disinterested part, well, some governments more than others. But Kenneth Arrow had the famous impossibility theorem where he asked, is it from individual preference orderings, can we aggregate up to a social preference ordering such that we know what the efficient thing to do is? And the answer is no. There's no way to aggregate individual preferences outside of a market, right? Just by, you get problems of non-transitivity in preferences. You get inconsistent rankings depending on the order in which you pose questions, how the agenda is set up, that sort of thing. And beyond that, I mentioned the information problems, but the incentive problems are, if you try to do it by voting to elicit what people want, that's got its own problems. Right? So as a consumer, you shop around, and if you're not satisfied with a product, you don't buy it again. And the mistakes you make fall on you. All right? So you have an incentive to get it right, and you pay attention. I bought this shampoo, and my hair started falling out. I think I'll switch to a different brand. That's not a personal story. But in voting, it doesn't matter who you vote for, you, one person. You're not swaying the election. So you vote for candidate A, and candidate A gets elected and does the wrong things. I shouldn't have voted for A. No, really, it didn't make a difference whether you voted for A. Or you voted for B and A got elected. That didn't make a difference either. And people understand this at some level. People do not spend hours and hours researching candidates the way they spend hours and hours researching TVs before they buy a TV, or cars before they buy a car. Right? And a politician is a big ticket item in a country where taxes are high. So you have what's called rational voter ignorance. Because your vote is not decisive, it would be irrational for you to put a lot of effort into deciding which candidate is really going to run things in a better way. So the result is you get low information voters, rationally low information voters. And then what do they vote based on? Their gut feelings. Right? So there's lots of evidence that tall candidates do better than short candidates, handsome candidates do better than ugly candidates. And candidates that have a message that resonates with people, even if it's all just, I'm searching for a non-R-rated term, even if it's all just fluff and cotton candy. Do you have cotton candy here or candy floss? Anyway, even if it's all just sloganeering, people make a choice. They vote expressively, right? But that's not a way to get efficient provision of public goods. Second problem in the political system is the incentive problem. If you assume that people are free riders in markets, and that's why the market won't provide goods with prohibitive exclusion costs, those same kind of people who are acting in a kind of rationally selfish way, they're going to look for benefits from the political system that they don't have to pay for. They're going to be just as shameless in the political system as they are in free riding in the market. They're going to be what economists call rent seekers. They're going to look for benefits for themselves at everybody else's expense. All right, so this is an important source of government failure. There are programs that benefit some people very intensely at the cost of the vast majority of us, but the cost to each of us is so tiny that we don't go out in the streets and protest about it. So if you're a shoemaker, and there are only a few shoemakers in any country, you lobby for tariffs or even quotas on imported footwear. It's worth millions of dollars to you. It maybe costs each consumer $1 a year. That's barely enough to cover the cost of putting a postage stamp on a letter to their congressman or their representative in Parliament. They're not going to be well organized. So there are concentrated benefits, dispersed costs. That's a recipe for rent seeking. So I think that explains tariffs, quotas, many licensing systems. I don't know how occupational licensing is here. In the United States, it's controlled by each of the 50 states. In some states, you need 200 hours of training to be an interior decorator or a florist. Right? So occupations where the health and safety of your clients is not even at risk. And why are those onerous restrictions in there? Because the incumbent florists and home decorators want to make it hard for people to compete with them. Right? They can charge more money by restricting the supply of competitors. Now, if you want to stop this kind of rent seeking, you have to organize. But organizing to improve public policy, that's a public good. It's subject to free riding. You bear all the costs, and the benefits shower down on everybody in society. So, prediction, there's not going to be that much of it. There's not going to be enough organizing to keep the level of rents, of transfer payments just to enrich people to its optimal level, which is 0, right? Because the people who pay are never willing to pay for it. But it's just not worth it for them to organize to stop it. So rent seeking is a negative-sum game because there's competition among different industries to get subsidies and tariffs in their favor, quotas, licenses, and that burns resources. So recent example, the black cab drivers in London organized. They had a big strike. Streets were filled with black cabs clogging traffic, and they were lobbying the London Transport Commission, Transport for London it's called, to ban Uber. Why? Because Uber was low-price competition, and they succeeded. So rents for the cab drivers, or the cab owners actually, too bad for the Uber drivers, too bad for the consumers. Right, so
there wasn't even the need for the writing and the protest. They just lobbied on their Uber's ban. That's what you mean.
So, Uber's strategy has been don't ask for permission, just go in and open up And then once we have enough riders, now we have a lobby. Now we have enough people who are going to scream if their Uber service is cut off. So maybe that'll happen in London, but I haven't heard anything out of the Uber riders. I don't know how long it had been in operation in London. But you see this in different localities. Some places ban Uber. In some cities, Uber is not allowed to pick people up at the airport because that's the real cash cow for the taxi companies. When there's a well-known phenomenon called Baptists and bootleggers, where the bootleggers, in the case of alcohol prohibition, were the people who supplied the illegal alcohol quite profitably. And so, but they can't exactly lobby for prohibition, right? They rely on people who are sincerely in favor of prohibiting alcohol on some moral or religious grounds, hence Baptists. It could have been called Methodists and moonshiners, same thing. So you see these kind of coalitions where there are people who profit, and they, if they support the lobbying efforts, they have to do it very quietly, but sometimes they do. I've been writing recently about the efforts to ban cash in different countries. And there's a group called Better Than Cash, the Better Than Cash Alliance, which will go and testify about how we have better payment systems, and in poor countries, they'll say it's better for people to be included in the financial system, and we can do that by opening up the banking system to them so that they use bank services and not cash to conduct their transactions. And it's all very nice if the argument is let's provide new and better options, but often they want to ban the use of cash to drive people into the banking system. And you won't be surprised to find out who supports the Better Than Cash Alliance. It's not just, it's organized by under the UN, but it's funded by Visa, MasterCard, Citibank. They all stand to gain from more transactions going through the gated payment systems that they operate. So that's something to look out for. When you see people in good faith, right? The Baptists are arguing in good faith for this restriction, but they're sort of being played by people who have a private greedy interest. An economist named Mike Munger likes to tease people for believing in what he calls the unicorn theory of government. And this is really just another way of telling the singing judge parable. So the unicorn theory is, well, I favor this government program, and when I think about it being implemented, I think about it being implemented by wise and beneficent politicians or bureaucrats, not the people who we actually know, not the people who are actually in office or people who are actually manning the bureaus. But, you know, the best kind of people we could imagine. And that's an unfair comparison, right? It's like saying, I have a solution for the transportation problem, or the problem of pollution in transportation. We're going to hire unicorns to pull carts. And unicorns, as you can see from the picture, their flatulence smells like strawberries and looks like rainbows, so no pollution problem. And somebody might object, you know, there aren't actually unicorns. So your scheme is not going to work. And likewise, a proposal that relies on being implemented by a government that's unlike any government the world has known, that's going to run into a problem. So let me stop there and take questions. Wow.
So actually, I was thinking yesterday, listening to Emily's presentation on minimum wage, if anybody has thought about minimum wage in this context, because it's really kind of interesting thing. Because really, you do have the same situation where you lobby for certain government policy that's going to help a certain group, and another group is hurt.
Yeah, so there are people who sincerely support minimum wages, thinking it will help, And for them, you point out the facts of the matter. But then there are people whose job depends on not understanding the theory because they represent interests who benefit from the minimum wage, like labor unions. They represent high-priced labor, so they want to exclude low-priced labor.
So in the case, like in your case of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, so you got a group that's going to get benefits,
Right.
and then a whole bunch of people are going to just pay a little amount of money, and it's not going to benefit them. But in the case of minimum wage, when you think about it, there's really kind of interesting problem. Because the losers, everybody talks about the unemployment that's created.
Right.
The losers are low-income people who don't get the benefit, like Emily talked about. You know, they might get hired by a firm and get training, and it's going to make a big difference in their life. If you think about this whole universe of low-income people that are deprived of this opportunity, and you theoretically do a calculation of the present value of this cost throughout their life, the number could actually be huge.
That's right.
Yeah, I wonder if anybody has really thought about this.
I don't know of anybody who's done that calculation, but that point has certainly been made. A colleague of mine, Walter Williams, talks about there being a wage ladder, and most people start in low-wage jobs. People without degrees of high education start in a low-wage job and move up through experience, but they've got to start somewhere. A minimum wage, he says, is like sawing off the lowest rung of the ladder.
Yeah, they never get an opportunity to get started.
Right.
And the present value over a lifetime is a very large number.
That's right.
So you accumulate all the people that suffer from this. This is a very meaningful amount of economic value that's foregone. And you just think about how could you possibly deal with this problem. I've never really seen this discussed anywhere.
Yeah, I haven't seen the present value calculation done, but that would be useful, yeah.
I have a question about positive and positive externalities and negative externalities.
Okay.
Vaccines, for example, until a certain point, it is a positive externality, because if I get vaccinated, then other people also get vaccinated. They get better.
They won't catch it from you.
They won't catch it from me. But at some point, you are not able to get all of the people, because then you have lobbies of people that are saying, no, it is bad for you, and you shouldn't get vaccinated. Like it's a trend that is happening today, and then you go back to less people getting vaccinated. So you have both positive and negative externalities in one case, I believe. So how do you deal with such a scenario?
It's a good question. If you get a vaccine, then you are protecting yourself against people who have the disease. I mean, there's no question that spreading disease is a kind of externality, something you'd be willing to pay your neighbors not to have. But if you get a vaccine, you do protect yourself against it being spread to you. And then the people who choose not to get vaccines for whatever reason, they think it's harmful, if everybody else is vaccinated, then they end up just harming themselves. But the problem is there are people who can't afford the vaccine.
There are people that just can't have the vaccine. Like they
Or
have a problem
they have a reaction to it.
with the immune system, so and they suffer from it because they rely on people getting the vaccine.
I see.
May I try to
Yeah.
answer that? Like, first of all, if we'll have a private priced healthcare system, then it would be obvious for a health insurance company to charge a higher premium for people not having vaccines, and in such a way, the external costs will be internalized. Unlike the system which is applied in most of the world, in which you pay for healthcare only in taxes, and so the healthcare system can't charge you more. Now, even if we have a governmental funded system, a smarter way than coercing people to vaccinate themselves is to just charge higher medicinal taxes for unvaccinated people, just like a private healthcare insurance company would do. And just another thing to add is that not all externalities must be taxed. You have to think it quite well. I mean, for example, if I wear deodorant in the morning, I provide external benefits to everyone compared to the alternative, and yet I'm not charging anyone for that.
Yeah, so the U.S. healthcare system is flawed in many ways because it's an unholy mix of private and public, but my healthcare company, as you suggest, in a sense pays me to get a flu vaccine each autumn by making it free. They reimburse it completely with no deductible, no co-payment, because it's cheap and it saves them costs compared to if I don't get it. So yeah, those kind of incentives work in that case. I mean, so if the question is, should we make a vaccine mandatory for some people to prevent spillovers to other people, you're going to end up coercing one side or the other. So that's a kind of moral dilemma, I think. If people want to stay away from the unvaccinated, there are ways to do that, right? So send your kids to a school that requires vaccination, and if there are some people who, for moral or health reasons, don't want to vaccinate their kids, fine, but I don't want my kids sitting next to them in class. Yeah.
I saw in your last thing you want to show us, if you didn't, it's about the nudge.
Yeah.
You want to
You want to talk about that?
Yes.
Okay.
I just want to know what is your opinion on that.
Okay.
Because
So
it is, I think, the opposite of what you think the government role in their citizens.
it depends on which Richard Thaler you read. So he's on two sides. All right, so here's the headline, Nudge Guru wins Nobel Prize for Economics. So here's the one edition of his book. The nudge is the parent elephant gently pushing along the baby elephant. All right, so that's a kind of paternalistic nudge. And it is a kind of paternalism. That is, somebody who knows better is helping somebody who doesn't know as well to make their choices. But it can be benign or it can be coercive. And Thaler's a little ambiguous. At some points he says, I'm a libertarian paternalist. I don't believe in coercing people, just in structuring the choices so that the default option is something that's good for most people. And it's hard to object to that. I mean, if you join a company and they have a pension plan, a private pension plan, there's got to be some default option. And if they set up a default option that provides people with the kind of standard of living in retirement that most people want when they're thinking about it dispassionately, that's fine. But they can opt out if they have some other idea.
So when it comes to nudge, you think that the government should take a role in our citizens' lives?
So there are all kinds of private nudges that Thaler talks about, like companies structuring their pensions, or at the company lunch counter, putting the healthy options first and the desserts at the back. So you've already got a full tray before you face the desserts, the tempting desserts. And so who can object to that? I can't object to that. But when the government gets involved, then you get all the problems of rent seeking and inadequate information to actually improve people's choices. Because to be an effective paternalist, to be a beneficial paternalist, you have to know what's actually good for somebody, better than they do. And so a parent and a child, sure, that's why it's called paternalism. But a government official to an adult, a mentally competent adult, prima facie, I don't see the case. Now, if the government official does know better, provide information. Tell people, look, most people are subject to the following biases, so be on guard against having those biases influence your decisions. Can't object to that either.
So, in your opinion, it's fine if a private company will trick adult people with nudge, but government no.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
So I worry in the case of coercive paternalism that the experts have their own biases, they have their own interests. They don't have so much incentive to actually look out for the best interest of the people who they're influencing. And it's changes from, I mean, people have called nudges things that are actually taxes and restrictions on choice. Well, we're going to take that option off the table because no sensible person would choose that. So we're just going to say, no, you can't smoke. Right? Rather than we put information on the package telling you that it's a health risk. Yeah.
The example of the pension plans, so theoretically the default pension plan can be presented as the one that's best for the worker, but theoretically it could be the best for the company offering the pension, or the cheapest option for the company in which the pensions are provided. So like what is the inherent I lost the word. What's the difference between government and private companies in that sense? Because private companies could also be rent-seeking at the expense of the workers.
So, yeah, that's a good question. Private companies who are providing pensions that they're not legally obliged to provide use it as part of the benefits package that goes with working for that company, and so it's dimensional on which they compete for workers. They said, look, we have a generous pension program. And usually when we're talking about the default option, it's how much more does the worker contribute on top of what the employer is contributing. Okay, so it's tax deductible, at least in the US, to contribute to your pension plan through your employer, but the employer's not getting any rake off. So there's no incentive for the employer to tell people to save more than they really ought to save.
Is the employer sets the default, or the company providing the pension, managing the pension?
The employer. So the pension provider is a financial institution that's a third party. Yeah.
The law itself came to protect me from others, all of us. Why should I, for example, the Dodd-Frank reform that is in the United States, why should I carry the burdens and all the crises that have been done in 2008, and wait till all this act, and right after that, the government took this action and started to protect their citizens. Why should I wait till the government wait for this kind of crisis and not before?
Well, the behavior of the U.S., I'll talk about this tomorrow, but the behavior of the U.S. government during the financial crisis is an example of rent-seeking and looking out for certain interests at the expense of the general public. Right? There was the so-called Troubled Asset Relief Program, which was hundreds of billions of dollars poured into the equity of private banks to benefit the shareholders of private banks at the expense of the ordinary taxpayer. I don't defend that. That's crazy. So I'm not sure which action you're thinking of, but Dodd-Frank. So Dodd-Frank comes along afterward and is a 2,000-page document which doesn't even tackle the main problem. It doesn't tackle the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac subsidies to bad housing mortgages, which was the seed of the financial crisis. But what does it do? It creates a new agency to look out for consumers by imposing new paperwork requirements on firms. Even though the mortgages that went into default were not, except in a very few cases, mortgages where people didn't know what they were getting into. They were mortgages where people thought that they could make a profit flipping houses or enjoy a bigger house because they were being given reduced monthly payments, and then turned out they couldn't afford them. But Dodd-Frank is such a big package of a bunch of different things that it's hard to characterize it in any one way. One thing Dodd-Frank does do, which I like, is it puts restrictions on the Federal Reserve's ability to bail out insolvent firms, which is a good thing, so that the firms will take more care not to become insolvent.
Go back to a little bit to Oak and Angela. What do you think about direct democracy, for example, like referendum? Like why in London they don't open? I mean, now there is like online, there is a technology which was already not available in the 1980s. Is it something that you think could be implemented and could help this kind of problems with rent seeking inside the government?
I missed the beginning of your question. What's the technology?
Like referendums, like you will put a referendum
Oh.
online in London. Do you want Uber or you don't want Uber? So there will be little cost of organizing the Uber riders, and then you could counteract the rent seeker, which have lobbyists and so on.
That would be better than not consulting the public. If it would stop Uber from being banned, then great. But it seems to me it shouldn't be up to the majority whether you get to call an Uber cab. It should be up to you and Uber. Can't see that you're creating a loss for anybody except the cab driver, but that's competition. Competition disciplines inefficient providers, but that's a good thing. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that it's hard to, if I understood correctly, to take public goods and properly assess them or turn them into like not private goods, but basically something that you'd be able to charge for, right? What did you call that?
Yeah, the problem of exclusion.
Right, okay, so do you have any ideas of like how, because you also said that it's like a potential opportunity for entrepreneurs to then figure that out.
Yeah.
So what are ways that people do to assess what others would be willing to pay?
Oh, well, so we have all kinds of electronic monitoring technology now. So I mentioned the system in Singapore. I mean, there's an electronic tag on each car that transmits its information as it passes a point, and so they can log who traveled on which street, and so you can charge people according to how much wear and tear they actually cause on the roads by seeing how many miles they drove.
That's not going to assess how much they'd be willing to do that.
Oh, well, so if you set up a price, this is what we're going to charge you for driving on this street, this is what we're going to charge you for driving on this street, people can choose to pay it or not pay it. So when you charge tolls on a limited access highway, you get an indication of what people are willing to pay. One of the interesting developments in tolling on highways in recent years has been toll lanes side by side with free lanes. So where I live, they added an additional lane to the big limited access beltway that goes around Washington, D.C. It would have been quite controversial if they'd taken an existing lane and turned it from free into toll, because then people are clearly losing out. But nobody really objected to them adding a lane, because they said, well, some people will take it, and that'll reduce the congestion in the lane that I've been traveling in before. So if you want faster travel, you want a less congested lane, you pay more. Right? And that provides the revenue to build the road in the first place. And how do they monitor who's using it? You put an electric transponder in your car, and when you enter, it flags, it records that you've entered it, and it sends you a bill, basically. Actually, you prepay and it debits your account, and then it tops it up when you've spent the $35 that was in your account. Right? So you can, the other night I was driving home from DC, it was rush hour, and I'd never seen these prices before because I don't usually drive then. To enter the toll lane and save, according to, I checked my phone, which I shouldn't do when I'm driving, I know. It would save me 7 minutes to take the toll lane, $10. 7 minutes, $10, that's $80 an hour. Is my time worth that much? Nah. I stayed in the free lane, but that's a measure of my willingness to pay. I wasn't willing to pay $10. If it had been $3, probably would have taken it. So there has to be some kind of tolling device. It doesn't have to be, you know, a gate the way it used to be, which was cumbersome and backed up traffic. But if you go this way, you will pay. And you've agreed in advance, and you've gotten the technology that gives you permission to drive in that lane without signaling a violation. I mentioned satellite TV. I mean, I'm not an entrepreneur, but that's the gist of it. People who can think of ways to charge users for amenities that previously were either free or not provided at all because the cost couldn't be covered, can provide goods that people are willing to pay for. And right, so that's a win-win situation.
Do you think the government has any job to educate people?
So this is a traditional defense of public education, that it provides external benefits to the rest of the population. So clearly there's a benefit to the child being educated and to the family of the child. That's who usually pays for it in a private education system. The question is, what are the benefits to the rest of society, and can we establish a case for people who don't have kids, for example, paying for the public education system like everybody else? It seems to me that if that's the rationale for them paying, they shouldn't be paying as much. All taxpayers should not be paying the same amount. There should be one charge for having your child in school and another charge for being a member of the general public who enjoys a spillover benefit, right, which is smaller than the benefit you get from having your child educated. But what are the usual spillover benefits people cite? They cite reduction in crime. What else?
A more like highly educated population, which means more professionals, which means higher economic growth.
Yeah, but the benefits of those people getting higher paying jobs goes to them, not to me.
That's both ways.
Better informed voters. That's usually
So-
for that.
But that's public
Better
education
informed, but
provided
still underinformed. So I guess we would have to try to, if we're seriously going to try to assess the taxes such that it's making it a win-win situation even for the taxpayers, then we have to try to estimate the benefits, which is hard in the absence of any, recorded measure of willingness to pay. I had a colleague who was working on the problem of willingness to pay for air pollution reduction, and they did something that was, he and his co-author did something that was better than I'd seen before. It's not perfect, but at least it's an honest attempt to get a measure. And that was, they did a telephone survey in Los Angeles and asked people, how much have you spent in the past week on medicines over-the-counter medicines to alleviate coughing, sneezing, runny nose, etc. And then they correlated that with the level of air pollution in different weeks. And they got an idea of when the air pollution index goes up by a point, how much more do people have to spend on their symptoms. And so people would be willing to pay that much, you would think, not to have the air pollution index go up by a point. So that's at least trying to tap into the expenditures people actually do make, although most people would rather not have to take the drugs and just have the lower air pollution. But in the case of education, I think most of the benefits are private. There may be some spillovers to other people, but so the question is, how much less would people be educated if you left it to them to pay for it, right? That's the impact that public education provides at the margin. And of course, you have to ask, how effective are the public schools at actually educating people? And most measures indicate that schools that parents pay for do a better job. In the public school systems, maybe not here, but everywhere I've lived, you have the problem of rent seeking, of teachers' unions who are paid much more than they would need to pay to replace them, and it becoming an enormously wasteful system. So even if there are spillover benefits, it could be more that the taxpayer is paying more for the system than the benefits justify, because it's a very inefficient system.
And what about educating people for values, like cycling or nutrition or sports?
I guess that's the sort of thing that their families should determine. So if parents want to send their kids to a school that has those features of the curriculum, that's great. But some people might not want to send their kids to a public school that educates their kids in values they don't share. Thank you very much.